November 22nd, 1963. A day that will go down in history. A day that shocked the nation and stunned the world. The day the president was shot.
The ABC Radio Network presents The Day the President Was Shot, a minute-by-minute account of John F. Kennedy's last day on Earth. Featured are the sounds and voices that made history on the 22nd day of November, 1963. The day the President was shot.
This is Fred Foy, ABC, New York. For John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the fateful day of November 22nd began at Fort Worth, Texas. The president had awakened early. He had much to do. He was on a political tour, a tour that took him to San Antonio and Houston and finally Fort Worth, where he had spent the night. This, for the president, was the start of his pre-campaign for re-election. With him was Mrs. Kennedy. It was the first time since before the birth and death of her third child that Mrs. Kennedy had accompanied the chief executive on any of his tours. And she appeared happy about it. When they arrived in Fort Worth the night before, they were greeted by some 5,000 persons at Carswell Airfield, and thousands more cheered them when they arrived at the hotel. But despite the obvious warmth and friendliness, Fort Worth police were taking strict precautions. Officers were stationed on the 7th and 9th floor stairs of the hotel to keep anybody from going to the president's floor. Literally dozens of other policemen took positions at various points within and around the hotel. In addition, city firemen were assigned to stand in the halls above and below, as well as on the president's floor. It was the first time anyone could remember such precautions being made. But as one fireman put it, the president doesn't visit very often. Shortly after Mr. Kennedy arose that Friday morning, a breakfast of 2 5-minute eggs, toast, orange juice, and coffee was sent up to his suite. Mrs. Kennedy had only juice, toast, and coffee. The time was 8:30. At 8:45, the president went down to make an appearance at a parking lot across from the hotel, where a huge gathering cheered and applauded. There was obvious disappointment that the First Lady wasn't with him. "She is organizing herself," laughed the president. After saying a few additional words, the president went back to the hotel to attend a Chamber of Commerce breakfast. As the president moved toward the podium, the people rose to their feet to cheer him. The time, 12 minutes after 9.
Ladies and gentlemen, I proudly present the President of the United States.
Though the welcome for the president was tumultuous, the gathering really went wild a short time later when Mrs. Kennedy appeared. The president took note of the fact.
2 years ago, I said that, introduced myself in Paris by saying that I was the man who had accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris. I'm getting somewhat that same sensation as I travel around Texas. Nobody wonders what Lyndon and I wear.
But aside from the joke-telling and laughter, the president, like any good salesman, was very much interested in getting his pitch across. The administration, said the president, was making a special effort in many directions.
As a result of the efforts which this country has made in the last 3 years, we are second to none. In the past 3 years, we have increased the defense budget of the United States by over 20%, increased the program of acquisition for Polaris submarines from 24 to 41, increased our Minuteman missile purchase program by more than 75%, doubled the number of strategic bombers and missiles on alert.
Also, as he had so many times in the past, the President emphasized the need for the American people to face up to their responsibilities in a rapid changing world.
I don't think that we are fatigued or tired. We would like to live as we once lived, but history will not permit it. The communist balance of power is still strong. The balance of power is still on the side of freedom. We are still the keystone and the arch of freedom, and I think we'll continue to do as we have done in our past, our duty.
Our duty. The word spoken just a short while before the President left for Dallas. Along the route to the airport, more crowds. People who came to see for themselves what their President looked like.
I got up at 5 o'clock. First time I set the alarm in years. The most important thing is to see the President, then to see Mrs. Kennedy. I think she's lovely, but I think our President does come first.
I see.
She's a lovely person.
But I waked up at 2:30 and couldn't go back to sleep, so this is a rough day.
Before the day was out, it would get rougher. Shortly after 11 a.m. Central Standard Time, the presidential plane, Air Force One, took off from Fort Worth for the short flight to Dallas. At 11:35, the plane landed at Love Field. Dallas, like Fort Worth, turned out to greet the first couple with enthusiasm. Thousands were on hand at the airport, and the President, as was his custom, walked over to the fence on the side of the field to mingle with the crowds, shaking hands, waving, smiling. By his side, the Vice President, Lyndon Johnson, and, of course, Mrs. Kennedy. At 11:50, the Kennedy motorcade left the airport for downtown Dallas. With the President and Mrs. Kennedy in their specially built car, Texas Governor John Connally and Mrs. Connally. Following behind, a string of other cars carrying Secret Service men, reporters and photographers, and local civic officials. At 12:15, the motorcade reached the fringe of the downtown area. Pierce Ullman, a reporter for ABC affiliate WFAA, gave this account of the motorcade's progress.
It was about 12:15 this afternoon. The car carrying President and Mrs. Kennedy, Governor and Mrs. Connally, and two Secret Service agents, an open car, had rounded the corner of Main and Houston Streets, had proceeded 1 block north up Houston Street, and had turned to the left on Elm Street, and was getting ready to go under the triple underpass.
The crowds, for the most part, were just as friendly as those in Fort Worth and the other Texas cities the chief executive had visited. But perhaps they were just a little bit thinner. Even so, the response to the President's waves was just as enthusiastic, just as warm. The time, 12:25. The motorcade had just moved through the downtown area toward the Dallas Trade Mart, where Mr. Kennedy was to speak. He was obviously enjoying himself. The weather was perfect, the temperature in the mild 60s. He had worried about that the day before. The weather hadn't been too good the past couple of days, and the President was afraid it might thin out the crowds. And anyway, clear skies meant that the bubble top to the car wasn't needed. The President preferred to ride without it. 12:28 p.m. The motorcade was averaging about 20 miles an hour through the downtown section. It picked up speed again slightly as it passed through the outskirts. Then it slowed as it reached a curve leading under that triple underpass. 12:29 p.m. The President waved at a cheering group standing by the road, and Mrs. Connally turned and smiled at Mr. Kennedy.
You can't say Dallas doesn't love you, Mr. President.
The time, 12:30. 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time.
We had just turned the corner, the motorcade had just turned the corner at, I believe it's Young and Elm. Is this correct? Elm in Houston. Elm in Houston, I'm sorry. Overlooking the street is a large building by the name of the Texas School Book Depository. Right. Just as the president's car turned the corner, I heard a loud shot that sounded like, at first, a backfire. And then I heard another one. And then, finally, a third shot. We naturally took this third shot as a rifle shot because we figured by the third shot that this was not a backfire. It was not a motorcycle backfiring, but it was actually someone taking a crack at the president. Just as our car rounded the corner, we saw the president's car speed off. I had my camera in my hand and raised it and to see an officer fall and pull his pistol. I took a shot of that, and then to my right, two ladies fell to the ground, and one of them had fainted. People were running hither and hither and yon. Up in the window, I could not tell what the person looked like, but I saw the rifle being pulled back into the window. This was the 5th or 6th floor. There were people underneath the rifle who looked up to see where the shots had come from.
That was Mal Couch, a press photographer, riding several cars behind the president's. Pierce Ullman was also an eyewitness.
Within a split second, one of the two Secret Service men in the front seat of the car grabbed the telephone, said, "Let's go to the hospital," and then he proceeded to make a call, presumably to other Secret Service men in the area, or perhaps the hospital. At any rate, the car was sped rapidly down Stemmons Freeway, both women holding their husbands in their arms, and was here at Parkland Hospital within a matter of 5 to 10 minutes.
Standing by the road at precisely 12:30, an unidentified woman with a camera. As the motorcade went by, as Mrs. Connolly turned in her seat and President Kennedy raised his arm to wave, she aimed her camera.
And I took the picture. It so happened my picture, when I took it, was at the same instant that the president was hit. And that does show in my picture.
What does the picture look like?
It shows the president. He slumped. Jackie Kennedy was leaning towards him to see. I guess it all happened so suddenly. I don't think anyone realized, what had happened.
Did you realize what had happened when you heard the shots?
No, I didn't. There was, 3 or 4 real close together. And it was, must have been the first one that shot him, because that was the time I took the picture. And during that time, after I took the picture, and the shots were still being fired, I decided I'd better get on the ground.
Did people lie down on the ground?
I just know about myself and the ones right close to me. And, really, I just know about myself.
You did lie down?
I did. I was no more than 15 foot from the car and in line of fire, evidently.
Did Mrs. Kennedy scream on the first shot?
I don't know about the first shot, but she did scream. She says, "My God, he's been hit, or he's been shot."
And the president fell in Mrs. Kennedy's arms?
No, I think he just slumped into the seat. She jumped up over him, and during time when she jumped up, of course, the car sped away real fast.
Now, the picture you took, I understand the FBI has it now.
Yes, that's right.
As the presidential motorcade drove by, Pierce Ullman of WFAA was standing at a window in the Texas Book Depository building, looking down on the street.
Just a few minutes ago, the President of the United States turned from Houston Street onto Elm Street on his way to a scheduled luncheon appearance at the Stemmons Trade Mart. As the president turned, applause broke out from a sparse crowd on both sides of the street. And as he went by the Texas School Book Depository, headed for the triple underpass, there were 3 loud, reverberating explosions. Nobody moved. Everyone seemed stunned. A few seemed to look around, wondering who has the firecrackers. Then suddenly the Secret Service men sprang into action. The convertible bearing the president and Mrs. Kennedy sped away, and officers, both plainclothes and uniformed, seemed to spring from everywhere at once, guns drawn, ordering people to lie flat.
Later, the wife of the Texas governor was to recall the horror of the dreadful moment when bullets rained down on the presidential car.
At that moment, Mrs. Connolly said she heard a shot. Instantly, when she heard the shot, her husband turned to see what had happened, and at that instant, he too was shot. Mrs. Connolly says she believes the first shot was the one that struck President Kennedy in the head. There was a second shot. That shot struck Governor Connolly in the back and coming out of his body in the right chest. There are reports of a third shot, and Governor Connolly has a wound on his wrist, and that could be the result of that third pistol shot, although Mrs. Connolly is not certain whether there was a third shot or not. She said immediately after the first shot, Mrs. Kennedy grabbed her husband. After the second shot, Mrs. Connolly grabbed her husband. All 4 of them ducked down into the car to escape any further fusillade of shots.
Only a few minutes had passed, minutes that flashed by with incredible speed, yet seemed to hang in the air with a weight of hours. The time was 12:36 Central Standard Time. ABC's Don Gardner gave the first bulletin, a bulletin to the effect that the president's motorcade had been shot at. And then, a short time after 1, this word.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States is dead of an assassin's bullet in Dallas, Texas. Shot by an assassin while his motorcade was moving along the streets on the outskirts of Dallas. Well, 250,000 people lined the streets to cheer his appearance there. It has been confirmed that the president is dead. Also cut down by the assassin's bullet, Texas Governor John Connolly. His fate is not known. At last word, he was still alive. And an aide of his talked with the Texas governor on the phone in the emergency room. He said he'd been shot through the back. Word reaches us that apparently it was done by an assassin armed with a high-powered rifle. A man and a woman were seen running away from a walkway near an underpass through which the president's motorcade was about to pass. The president lingered after the bullets entered his body. Mrs. Kennedy quickly went to his aid, helped him as he slumped down on the back seat of his bubble-top limousine. Mrs. Connolly, also in that first car, helped her husband, the Texas governor. Vice President Johnson, also wounded by a bullet. The president, cradled in his wife's arms, rushed in his blood-spattered limousine by the Secret Service to Parkland Hospital, taken immediately into an emergency room. A call went out for neurosurgeons and for blood. Transfusions were given. The doctors did what they could. Priests were called. The last rites of the Catholic Church were given to President Kennedy. And then we had word that as the priests came out of the emergency room, they said, the President of the United States is dead. Immediately after that, the word flashed on United Press International, and the Associated Press came up with the same story, the President is dead. Washington sources confirmed that the President had passed away. Information that he lived not very long after the bullets from a high-powered rifle entered his body while his limousine went through downtown Dallas. Immediately, The President of the United States now becomes the former Vice President, Lyndon Johnson.
In Washington, the United States Senate was in session at the moment in history when the assassin's bullet struck the president. Richard Riddell, the elderly dean of the Senate pages, will never forget that moment.
I first learned of the tragedy, the assassination of President Kennedy, when one of my assistants, Tom Pelican, rushed out and told me, adjacent to the lobby, that Phyllis Rock of the staff of Senator Morse, who was following the AP ticker in a routine manner, watching for routine dispatches, said, "It has come over the ticker, the president has been shot. President Kennedy has been shot." Thereupon, I rushed into the Senate floor and told the leaders, Senator Mansfield, Senator Dirksen, and about a dozen other senators who were nearby. I raised my voice on the Democratic side to this group so that about a dozen senators at a time could hear, and I said, "The president has been shot." And then I stepped over the aisle to the Republican side by Senator Dirksen and said, "President Kennedy has been shot." I immediately recalled that I had only moments before noticed the president's brother, Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts, presiding over the Senate. I turned and saw he was still occupying the chair. So I rushed up and I said, "Senator, your brother, the president, has been shot." As nearly as I can recall, with great calm and composure, you could tell his entire body tensed with a jolt, as though he had been hit with a club. And if I recall correctly, Senator Kennedy said no.
ABC correspondent Pete Clapper, at that moment sitting in the Senate gallery, remembers what happened next.
At that point, pandemonium broke loose. Senators gathered in knots on the floor to discuss the news, which was then pretty vague. The majority leader called for a recess pending developments, as he put it. I left the Senate gallery. I ran down to the majority leader's office. There I was unable to find Majority Leader Mansfield, who was on a hotline to the White House trying for more news. I did, however, talk to Senator Aiken and managed to discuss this terrible thing with him. Then we went out to the Senate floor and discussed it with a number of senators, some of whom would not even comment. Senator Hart of Michigan, too stunned to say anything, absolutely refused, tears in his eyes. Senator Carlson, Republican from Kansas, said nothing could be worse. Senators still stood on the Senate floor, stunned in little huddles. It was probably the worst, most stunned episode in the Senate, perhaps in our lifetimes.
The impact of the deed for Vermont Senator George Aiken was the same for everyone.
I can't believe it, Peter. Just can't believe that President Kennedy's been shot.
The red, white, and blue presidential plane carrying Secretary of State Dean Rusk and 5 other cabinet members was out over the Pacific, headed for Japan, when the White House flashed the word to the aircraft. ABC correspondent John Scally was aboard that plane.
The first word that the president had been shot was flashed to the plane almost 2 hours after it had left Honolulu en route to what was to have been a goodwill visit to Japan. It came in the form of a flash from a special news ticker installed in the forward compartment of the big jet. It was 8:38 in the morning Honolulu time. In 12 minutes, the plane made emergency contact with the White House, and the fact that the president had been wounded was confirmed. Mr. Rusk immediately called the rest of the cabinet members around him and told them the news and ordered the plane to head back to Honolulu. The Secretary of State then talked by phone to the Undersecretary of State, George Ball, who was at his desk in Washington. At 9:32, 54 minutes after the first word, White House Press Secretary Pierre Salinger, who was aboard the plane, talked with the White House Situation Room. He was told, the president is dead. Mr. Salinger immediately told Mr. Rusk, who then made an announcement over the plane's public address system. The Secretary of State said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Secretary of State speaking. We have received official confirmation that President Kennedy is dead. I am saddened to have to tell you this grievous news. We have a new president. May God bless our president, our new president, and our nation."
The day the president was shot will continue after 10 seconds for station identification.
Dead, the president. Dead. The time, 1 p.m. Only 20 minutes before, as confusion and shock fell upon the world, the mortally wounded president had been rushed to Dallas's Parkland Hospital. A surprised ambulance attendant by the name of Audrey Wright described the scene.
Well, we was standing by with another patient when everyone started running in and hollering for ambulance cots or cots to transport someone out of a car. And we stood by while they brought the president and I guess the governor and the vice president come walking in, which was when everyone then knew what had taken place. And of course, they run everyone out of the hospital if they could at the time. And then they had us stand by on the ambulance dock in case we had to transfer one of the patients to another hospital.
Another ambulance driver by the name of Dennis McGuire was also present. He was standing by the admissions desk near the emergency entrance when the limousine sped up to the door.
One of the Secret Service men came in with a machine gun and was started hollering for someone to get some stretchers out to the front. Then after that, the vice president, they walked him in. He was very pale. They took him into minor medicine, and then not too long after that, well, then they brought the governor in, and then following him was the president with his wife following along behind him. And she was quite bloody and very upset.
First come the governor of Texas, and then immediately following him was, on the litter was the president. His wife was following behind him. She was completely covered in blood. From the waist down, it looked like her legs and her hands and everything was very bloody. Mrs. Kennedy came into the room and took a ring off her finger and placed it on the finger of the president, and then in turn kissed his hand.
With Mrs. Kennedy at the hospital, Mrs. Earl Cabell, wife of the city's mayor.
She said very little. I sat by her for a while, and then a priest of her church came up, and I stood back for him to speak with her. But before he had a chance to say really anything to her, they had brought the president's casket out, and we all moved out then.
We loaded the president into the casket, and I helped load the head, the top of the body, and I had some blood on my hand from the president.
The casket was then rolled slowly down the corridor toward the hospital entrance. An open hearse stood waiting.
She simply put her hand on the casket, and walked out to the entrance with her hand on the casket.
Mrs. Kennedy rode in the back. She was the only one back there with the president in the hearse.
The time, nobody noted. As the president's body was borne to the Dallas airport, shock, sadness, and anger spread through the nation. In Washington, the shock was especially acute. ABC's John Rolfson reported from the Senate chamber.
I've just come from the office of the Senate Majority Leader, Senator Mansfield, who got the official word from the White House at about 15 minutes ago that the president was dead. Senator Mansfield is now alone in the office with Senator Dirksen, the Republican leader. They have been quietly sitting, talking very little, and simply waiting. In a few minutes, they are going to make a statement on the president's death. But this great shock has, of course, been to them perhaps as a greater loss than to most.
When the news reached him in Washington, Soviet Ambassador Anatol Dobrinin needed only 8 words to describe his feelings.
I am deeply shocked by this terrible news.
In New York, word of the shooting raced through the corridors of the United Nations building.
The delegates from 111 countries are in a state of shock and incomprehension.
And from Europe, this word.
The BBC announcement that the president definitely was dead came exactly 20 minutes ago. An announcement following a direct report from a BBC correspondent in Washington. After the announcement that the president had died, there was a long period of silence, perhaps 2 minutes, after which a BBC announcer came in and said, "You'll pardon the period of silence, but we're trying to compose ourselves and decide what to do next."
As word of the president's assassination reverberated around the world, federal agents and Dallas police launched an extensive manhunt for the killer. A short time after the president was rushed to the hospital, another shooting occurred in Dallas. A patrolman by the name of J.D. Tippett shot by an unknown person he had tried to question. The killer, a man by the name of Lee Harvey Oswald, a former Marine who at one time had attempted to obtain Soviet citizenship. After shooting patrolman Tippett, Oswald headed for the rooming house where he lived. The housekeeper there, Mrs. Erline Roberts, had just gotten the word of the president's death on the radio.
As I got the word that President Kennedy had been killed, I turned it on to see, and he come in in an unusually hurry, and I said, "Oh, you sure in a big hurry." And he went in and got a coat and put it on. He was in his shirt sleeve and went back out, and this bus stopped, and he hadn't said nothing else.
Not long after, an already stunned nation was to hear of Oswald's latest crime.
And here in the ABC newsroom in New York, we've received another urgent story from Dallas, Texas, which says, this adds a bit of mystery to the entire thing, a Secret Service agent and a Dallas policeman were shot and killed today, some distance from the area where the president was assassinated. No other information is available on that report.
The first reports proved only half accurate. No Secret Service agent died on this Black Friday. Exactly 90 minutes from the time of the president's assassination, police tracked Oswald to a movie house. Ron Weiland of WFAA in Dallas was an eyewitness to the capture.
Several hundred officers swarmed through every entrance in the theater and found this man sitting in the second row from the back. He was armed with a shotgun. The officers jumped him, wrestled the gun away from him, and then pulled him out through the doors with him screaming, "I protest this police brutality." He was really fighting them all the way, kicking and screaming and hollering until he got to the front entrance of the theater. There was a crowd, I'd say, of 2,000 or 3,000 people had been attracted to the theater by all of the screaming sirens and people descending on the area. And as they pulled the man out through the theater, the officers threw a cordon around him. The people stomped the cordoned down. They brushed past the police officer and tried to grab the man, shouting, "Murder him," and all sorts of such things as this, and tried to get to him. And I dare say if they had have gotten to him, that they would have pulled him to pieces. Dallas is in an uproar.
Shortly after Oswald's apprehension, Dallas Police Chief J. Edward Curry faced reporters.
Chief, has Oswald given any indications of cracking in the under question? So far as I know, he has not. How long has he been under questioning now? I don't know exactly how long he's been under question. It's been intermittent. It has not been continuous. But so far, he's given absolutely no sign of weakening under the questioning. No. Are you and the rest of the police convinced you are the right man now? I think we do.
Vice President Johnson was sworn in as the 36th President of the United States exactly 99 minutes after Mr. Kennedy's death. Mr. Johnson took the oath in the presidential jet plane as it stood at Love Field in Dallas. One newsman was allowed to witness the swearing-in ceremonies of Lyndon Johnson. His description of that historic event as related to other reporters.
He told us that Mrs. Kennedy came into the compartment where the swearing-in ceremonies took place shortly before the 2:39 p.m. swearing-in ceremonies. He said she came in without assistance. She stood on Vice President Johnson's left, and Mrs. Johnson stood on her husband's right. He said he noted that Mrs. Kennedy's hose on both legs was virtually saturated with blood. As he said there was also a quantity of blood on her dress.
Ironically, Judge Sarah Hughes, who administered the oath of office to Mr. Johnson, had been appointed a U.S. District Judge by President Kennedy. Judge Hughes describes the events up to and including the swearing-in ceremonies at Love Field in Dallas, aboard Air Force One.
By the time that I got there, of course, my mind was on the job ahead of me. When I got to the airplane, I was met by one of his aides and the Secret Service and was taken immediately to the compartment where the Vice President and Mrs. Johnson were. The Vice President, whom I have known for a long time, said that he wanted to wait for just a moment until Mrs. Kennedy could get there because she wanted to see the ceremony performed. I was handed a Bible, which was on the plane, and someone also gave me the oath of office, which had been typed out. In a moment or two, Mrs. Kennedy came in while her face witnessed the grief which she was experiencing. She was calm and composed and was not the least bit hysterical. The Vice President told her who I was and that her husband had appointed me a U.S. District Judge. I asked the Vice President to hold up his right hand, and he repeated the oath after me that he would perform the duties of President of the United States to the best of his ability, and that he would protect, defend, and preserve the Constitution of the United States. And although it wasn't on the printed oath which had been given to me, I I added, so help me God, which he repeated after me as well. He leaned over and kissed his wife and kissed Mrs. Kennedy, and I held out my hand to him and told him that though the task was going to be a tremendous one, that we all had confidence in him and that we would do everything in our power to see that he carried on as we all expected him to. My thoughts as I left the plane and as I heard him tell the pilot to start the plane for Washington were that this was a great man with great ability, and I had confidence that he would be able to assume the duties of president and would carry on to the benefit of all of us.
Well, madam, how did it feel to be the first woman ever to administer a presidential oath?
Well, I didn't think of my job as being the first woman. I didn't feel anything about its importance. As I rode out to the airport, I had just been given an assignment, and that was the task that I had to perform.
And so, just 99 minutes after Mr. Kennedy's death, Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson became the 36th President of the United States. The time, 2:39 p.m.
After the swearing-in ceremonies, President Johnson reportedly kissed Mrs. Kennedy and then his wife. And then he said, and these are the only words he is reportedly to have uttered after the swearing-in ceremonies, "Let's get this plane back to Washington."
Meanwhile, overhead, a commercial airliner was ordered to circle the airport. Aboard, ABC Radio News Director Tom O'Brien.
I was filled with impatience as our jet continued to circle Love Field. Looking out the window by my elbow, I saw with fascination a huge silver 707 with an orange-colored nose cone poised for takeoff from the main runway. The fact that these markings denote a U.S. military plane just didn't sink in at the time. Ever since I boarded the flight in Denver, my one concern was for President Kennedy and Vice President Johnson. Because of the fairly carefree attitude of my fellow passengers, I was sure that few of them had heard about the ambush. This fact was confirmed when the plane's pilot announced dramatically, "Ladies and gentlemen, President Kennedy is dead. The jet on our port side is carrying his body back to Washington."
The time was 2:40 p.m., Central Standard Time. The date, November 22nd, 1963. The President was going home. His last trip.
The ABC Radio Network wishes at this time to extend its appreciation to ABC affiliate WFAA in Dallas, Texas, for its generous assistance in helping to cover one of the most tragic stories of our time. Nevertheless, a tragedy that had to be reported to the American people.